When you've been in education for 20 years, there are stories that are imprinted on your heart forever. There was a little dude in kindergarten who exhibited elopement behavior. That school psychologists speak for he would jet off out of a classroom or out of the building if you weren't careful. We had all kinds of safety plans and procedures in place to keep little dudes safe, but as with any great plan, there's a hitch in it every now and again. And it was in those hitches that little dude would take his opportunity and he would go. Well, one day I was headed back onto campus, and as I was walking towards those front doors, I saw a little dude running down the hallway, and I knew exactly what was happening. I had a split second to make a decision about what I was going to do. So I set my bag down and promptly walked to the grass, where I dropped to all fours and began frantically looking around in the grass. Obviously. Little dude came out the front doors and stopped in his tracks to see me in the grass. And he just watched me for a few moments before finally asking, "Miss Erin, what are you doing?" Well, I looked up at him and I said, "I'm hunting 4-leaf clovers because today has been a really rotten day and I'm really trying to turn it around." And went back to looking in the grass. Well, just about the time little dude was tired of standing there and was about ready to take off, wouldn't you know it, I found one. We celebrated with a huge hug, and then he triumphantly took that 4-leaf clover into the building, where he showed first the principal and then his teacher before getting back to work. That approach worked not once, but twice that year. I am convinced there was something special in the grass of that school that grows those 4-leaf clovers. But what I really like about this story is it's a great example of radical acceptance. See, I couldn't control little dudes running, but I could attempt to influence his behavior with my own. By releasing control, I actually freed him up to come back to me. So what is this radical acceptance thing? Well, the Berkeley Wellbeing Institute says radical acceptance is accepting what is not under your control and embracing what is happening now in a non-judgmental way. Jenny Tates, in a New York Times article, says radical acceptance means recognizing your emotional or physical distress and wholeheartedly practicing acceptance. And Psych Central says radical acceptance means practicing a conscious effort to acknowledge or honor difficult situations and emotions, fully accepting things as they are instead of ignoring, avoiding, or wishing the situation were different. That radical acceptance can be a critical step in moving through an experience to experience more meaning. But what does this really mean in life? Early in my career, I was working with a student who had multiple learning disabilities that presented in multiple different ways. She had an 8-letter first name and 2 hyphenated, long last names, but couldn't spell cat. She was the sweetest, most loving little bug who tried her heart out every day. And we would both become so frustrated because that light bulb moment just wouldn't come. You name it, we tried it with fidelity. But letters and numbers just remained a mystery to her. And I was failing her daily. The reality in retrospect was that little bug was experiencing active trauma at the time, and learning was not the most important thing in her life. Safety, both physical and psychological safety, were far more pressing needs. I needed to step back and see the big picture. I needed to step back and accept her. I needed to release control over the situation to actually free her up to learn. But what she had to learn first was what a safe adult felt like. And I had to get out of my own way to make her feel that way. I often wonder what could have happened had I gotten radical then. You see, I was a good teacher. Maybe I could have been a great one. In my role as behavior specialist, I worked with many, as the great Tim Feeney would call them, chronically cranky students. From little ones who would act out because they didn't have the words to express what they were feeling, to the big ones who had the words and could cut you with those words if you weren't careful. There was the student who was easily 2 feet taller than I am and roughly the size of the door, who would use his body to physically intimidate others into leaving him alone. There was the preteen who loved to point out your shortcomings loudly. To the bigger the audience, the better. He taught us humility quick. And there were students who would push back against any kind of problem-solving conversation because their brains just weren't ready yet. No matter their age, they taught me I didn't have all the answers, which could have led me to the doorway of radical acceptance, but instead led me to the door of burnout. You see, I was trying to control these situations and scenarios so much and have all the answers, but the reality is I had no control and I was out of answers. It was the times that I released control and hunted those four-leaf clovers, so to speak, that I really had the most powerful outcomes. Can you imagine what a lens of radical acceptance could have done for me and the individuals I served? I was a good behavior specialist. Maybe I could have been great at it. Just accepting where they were and meeting them there, realizing that in my own lack of perfection and discomfort, that if I let go, we could have more empowering outcomes for both of us. Instead of, we must problem solve and make a plan, can you imagine if I had led with, have you eaten today? And when's the last time you had any water? Maybe we would have gotten to more problem-solving conversations in the end. And maybe radical acceptance could have saved me from burnout. You know, when your own child grows up and heads off to college, radical acceptance comes and smacks you right in the face. Overnight, we go from having a lot of control and safety cocooned around our babies to sending them off somewhere else to make their own decisions without us. They decide if they're going to study, if they're going to go to class, or if they're going to go out to that party. They decide how they're going to make their money and what they're going to spend their money on. They decide their major and what classes they're going to take to hopefully graduate on time. It was when I realized that I let go of control that the phone calls started coming in. One of my favorites was when she called one day to say, "Mom, I want to work with kids, but I don't want to be a teacher. What's that thing you were telling me about again?" I am now radically accepting my daughter's career path of speech pathology and everything that comes along with it. What a gift. But what could I have done differently had I been more radically accepting of that same fierce girl when she were younger? You see, I was a good mom. Maybe I could have been a great mom. But again, the reality of radical acceptance is it's not one of those dishes best reserved for others. It's one of those dishes best served warm at home. For all the grief the COVID-19 pandemic served up to all of us, it actually kickstarted my own work of radical acceptance for myself. A most daunting challenge and one of the slowest motion aha moments I have ever had. It was during those early days of the pandemic on Zoom that I noticed I was struggling with my ADHD in new ways, and that some old behaviors were really exacerbated when online. I was struggling with focus and blurting, big emotions, and rejection sensitivity in new and interesting ways. You see, perfectionism and high expectations are a blessing and a curse. I then realized that these weren't just current struggles because of COVID. They were actually historic issues that I could remember as far back as elementary school. See, I remember Mrs. Witeka, my second grade teacher, writing on one of my papers, Erin colored her sky green and her grass blue just to be different. Please talk to her about this. I remember being crushed and hysterically crying in my room while being labeled as overdramatic. Interesting aside, hysterical crying in my room is my go-to response anytime a character dies in a Disney movie as well. My mom would say something like, honey, if you would just calm down. My dad would say things like, honey, if you would just get your act together. My report cards called me a daydreamer and flaky. My middle school teachers told me that if I would just apply myself, I'd be at the top of the class. My favorite high school teacher told me that if I would just pay attention to the details, my writing would really take off. I lived my life in that frame for decades, telling myself if I would just focus more, stop daydreaming, quit wasting time, try harder, stop being dramatic, just stop being lazy, I'd be better off. But again, the reality is those justs are just me. They're organically, originally, neurologically me. I am a blurter. I can usually control it unless something you say triggers a random song lyric in my brain, in which case there's a good chance that I'm going to burst out in song, whether you have heard that song before or not. My emotions are big. When I'm worried, when I'm frustrated, and when especially I'm sad. They always have been. I've learned to step back and be more curious about my emotions and really figure out the why behind them now, but they're still big, and I suspect they always will be. But radical acceptance leads me to resist trying to control those emotions and really gives me permission to just accept them the way they are, because discomfort doesn't mean danger. Rejection sensitivity comes with my ADHD too. For years, I questioned if I belonged places, and I judged myself and my abilities. I really believed in that imposter syndrome. Still, sometimes I feel like I'm a fraud and somebody's going to find out and I'll be fired. But let's just keep that between you and me. It's really hard to accept that my brain is hardwired to think this way, but the power of telling myself my brain is wired to think this way is the power of saying, this is something my brain does. That doesn't make it true. I lived 40 plus years of my life struggling and fighting my ADHD and seeing it as something that made me less than. The gift of time during COVID was the gift of learning radical acceptance of myself. Now, do not get me wrong, I am not finished yet, but my journey is going exactly as it's supposed to. While radical acceptance is often individualized and difficult, there are some things that our schools could do to release control while maintaining that learning environment. Approaches such as restorative practices and collaborative problem solving empower our youth to heal harm caused, while problem-solving alternatives to social situations. Our schools could implement more trauma-informed supports and strategies to honor the backgrounds and needs of our students. And the adults in our system can engage in their own social emotional learning and work on radical acceptance themselves. Maybe radical acceptance could be the thing to take our schools from good to great too. And now this brings us to you. Yes, you. Today's the day to get radical and accept some things that free us up to be who we're really meant to be. What is something in your life that you're trying desperately to control? What is some element of your life that radical acceptance could free your spirit up to accept just as it is? What are you struggling to make fit into a mold you were never meant to fit? Maybe radical acceptance could be the thing to take you from good to great, too. In the past, I was a good teacher. I was a good behavior specialist and a good mom. But now I'm practicing radical acceptance to take me from good to great every day. So I invite you to join me on this journey, not for those 4-leaf clover moments that make us all great. Thank you.